Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for attending our last webinar for 2022. It seems we have saved the best for last because we are so privileged to host Anton Swanepoel this morning. Anton will provide us with a regulatory update, talk a bit about the COFI Act, and also talk about some of the findings of the Ombud. Before I hand over to Anton, I'd like to just take a moment to thank everyone. Thank you so much for attending the webinars throughout the year. It was great to see on the attendance reports some regular faces, those regular attendees on the calls. We really appreciate and value your attendance. We believe that next year we will be able to bring you even better content, excellent speakers, and we look really forward to a great year of some more Zoom webinars. Before I hand over, just one other technical aspect. We've been asked by some of the advisors recently about where they can find some of the content that we publish, the webinars, etc. Post the sessions, we normally send an email containing the webinar. If there were any presentations, we will attach that as well. But we also upload everything to the YouTube channel as well as our website. So on the screen now, you'll see our website, www.amity.co.za. And when you click there on the Insights and Resources tab, you'll be able to find publications, fact sheets, CIS fact sheets specifically, and then as well any of the video content. So all of the videos all the webinar recordings will then be posted there as well. So I'd like to just urge you all to go and explore the website, take a moment just to work through the website, and please, you are so welcome to share with me any commentary you have on the website, the ease of access. We really continuously try and improve the user experience of our website. So ladies and gentlemen, that's all from me for this year. Most probably the last webinar, the last time you'll see me on screen for the year. But it was great, and I'm going to hand over now to Anton, and thank you again, Anton, for doing this presentation this morning.
Hello and welcome to this regulatory update. November 2022. Who could have imagined that time flies as it did? It is my privilege to give you a very short overview of what is happening on the regulatory front, and hopefully you'll take away a couple of practical suggestions to consider for your practice going forward. Colleagues, this is the short agenda. Firstly, we are just going to have a look at what the regulatory landscape looks like at this time. Secondly, we're going to have a brutal look at the facts. We are going to do some interpretations around those facts, and then of course recognize some of the challenges that financial advisors and intermediaries are facing, have faced, and will continue to face. And having said that, I just have to, as part of the introduction, just recognize that hats off to all the advisors and intermediaries who have managed to survive and even thrive in the time that we have gone through over the last 2 to 3 years. What you guys have done is just nothing short of remarkable. I'm continuously amazed at your resilience, the fact that you just never say die. You continue with a passion for your clients, and honestly, I can just say a salute. I hope that some of the information that you are going to gain today will not prevent you from continuing with the necessary enthusiasm for your clients and your businesses. So colleagues, we are not simply going to highlight the factual aspects around the regulation. We are also going to try and look at some practical suggestions that you can contemplate when you enter the festive season. What has happened over the last 2 decades? In 2001, we saw the introduction of FICA. And of course, what changes we haven't seen there. And then shortly after, the Phase Act was introduced. We had the theme of the regulator communicated to us shortly thereafter around treating customers fairly, which is an international theme, and we will see that play out in the new legislation and market conduct legislation that is about to enter the market. And of course, the discussions and deliberations we've had over retail distribution review, some of those deliberations have been incorporated in the Phase Act and more specifically in the General Code of Conduct. And then last but not least is the Protection of Personal Information Act. Colleagues, what changes have we not seen on the regulatory front? And again, hats off for all of you who managed to incorporate this in your business. And then, of course, to add insult to injury, the next wave about to hit us is the main topic of today's discussion. Colleagues, I think you and I will agree that we are totally overregulated as an advisory and intermediary force. With all the legislation that have been implemented so far, plus adding to that our political pressure, our load shedding, our challenges as a country, crime, corruption, you can make up your own list. These are a number of items that add additional pressure to all of us. And we must be the most resilient nation on the face of the earth. And over and above that, we are trying to encourage our clients as they face their own challenges. And then to add insult to injury, we have got the Financial Sector Regulation Act, read with COFI, that's on its way. Currently, COFI is a bill, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail in a slide or two's time. And then, of course, adding to that is the Conduct of Business Return Initiative that the FSCA has introduced to us. Commentary was received by the industry or from the industry, and we will have to see what the outcome of the industry response have been. And adding to that, we know that RDR is not over yet. There are still some proposals by the regulator that we must consider. And then, of course, another looming initiative is around activity-based remuneration that the FSCA is also toying with. So, as you can see, the existing legislation plus COFI that is on its way, with all the other ripple effects on the regulatory front, I think we're in for a bit of strategic planning. And this is really what this session is all about. Briefly, what is the FSR Act and why do we address it before we pay attention to COFI? Is the Financial Sector Regulation Act is really there to create a system of regulation in the financial services industry. And a couple of the objectives is really there. It's an umbrella that opens the door for all the other pieces of legislation to fall into place. The positive of this piece of legislation is that it opens the door to create a level playing field for all financial institutions. I have tested some of you on this concept in the past, and I repeat the question again. Did you not feel, as financial advisors and intermediaries, that we were actually the testing ground for market conduct legislation. All eyes were on us. If ever anything went wrong, it's in most instances the advisor is to blame, and the onerous nature of the Phase Act really made us feel as advisors and intermediaries as if there's an unlevel playing field. We are always at the forefront of accountability. Now, the positive of the market conduct legislation is that at the outset we needed this legislation, the Financial Sector Regulation Act, to create a level playing field for all institutions, product suppliers and financial services providers alike. And there's one standard of accountability. So to regulate and supervise financial product suppliers and financial services providers confirms there's a desire to have one level playing field for all providers of financial services, and then of course to improve market conduct by financial institutions. So all in all, it is a very honorable intention. And then of course, what does it pave the way for? The Financial Sector Regulation Act paved the way for the Conduct of Financial Institutions Bill to be communicated with industry and invite comments. This is what we have done since, if memory serves correct, the first draft in 2017. And then of course, the main theme of this Financial Sector Regulation Act is to create an environment where we have got market conduct on the one side and the prudential authority. So Twin Peaks was birthed through the Financial Sector Regulation Act. You needed this overarching legislation to pave the way for all the other pieces of legislation from a market conduct point of view and a financial stability point of view. So in a nutshell, what does the COFI bill mean to us? On the left-hand side of your screen, you can see a number of financial sector pieces of legislation, and the idea is to bring all of those under the Financial Sector Regulation Act and the Conduct of Financial Institutions Act, ultimately, with the overarching theme of treating customers fairly. So this means that the Phase Act is going to be replaced by COFI. And to understand that, we are briefly going to touch on the objectives of COFI. Currently, as I said, it's a bill. It's not legislation yet. It's in the proposed stage, and we expect COFI to become law in the next year or so. It was the idea to put it before Parliament before the end of this year, but it seems unlikely. So, briefly, what is COFI all about? It's really about creating a regulatory framework for market conduct, consumer protection, for fair treatment of financial customers, to promote trust and confidence in the financial sector, and to support sustainable competition in the marketplace. Also, themes like inclusion and transformation are part of the regulatory objectives around the COFI legislation. Unfortunately, COFI consists of, the latest version consisted of over 300 pages of legislation. So we can see what's coming. If we have to compare that against FAYS. It's just to give you a point of reference of what COFI is going to mean. The FAYS Act primarily paved the way for us to have subordinate legislation. So FAYS is the backbone, the main piece of legislation, and FAYS created themes like fit and proper requirements and the General Code of Conduct. So we refer to the fit and proper requirements and the Code of Conduct as subordinate legislation, part of the same legislation, but FAYS, the Act itself, is the primary source of reference. Now, COFI, a lot of people don't like me using this term, but to make it practical for you, COFI is really FAYS on steroids, because it incorporates all the other institutions under the same umbrella. But what does it mean for you and I? We have got the FAYS Act being replaced by COFI with the same principles, and some of those principles on steroids. I will refer to some of those under the conduct standards. So if I have to refer back very quickly, under FAYS, we spoke about the General Code of Conduct. Under COFI, those principles are referred to conduct standards. That is how we will refer to the principles in the Code of Conduct. But the subordinate legislation, according to the FSCA, is also about 300 pages in total. So we can see that there is the FAYS Act on steroids coming, and if you look quantity-wise, under FAYS we had about 160 pages, give or take, in total. But under the FSR Act, COFI, and the conduct standards, the subordinate legislation, we are looking at more than 900 pages of legislation coming our way. Of course, there are ripple effects of overregulation. So bear in mind that I did warn you in the beginning, take note of the negatives, but there are some positives that we will close off with that will give you a little bit of hope. Overregulation have got some ripple effects, of which one, small FSPs will find it increasingly more difficult to be operational because of a lack of resources, a lack of funding. It will make it much more necessary for small practices to have a very slick, effective and efficient circle of friends around them. People who support them, people who are knowledgeable, technology, etc., will become all the more important for small FSPs. Of course, with this wave of legislation, FSPs run the risk of becoming compliance driven. To a large extent, it's been my experience that many FSPs find it increasingly more difficult to be effective, efficient because of legislation and compliance. The burden of administration is going to pick up. Unfortunately, this is some of the worst news around the COFI legislation. I'll touch a little bit around the Conduct of Business Return Initiative from the FSCA, and we'll spend some time to highlight the admin burdens that FSPs will have to face when COFI is implemented. Of course, we already sit with a very poor advisor experience with a lot of paperwork to be completed, and that spills over into a negative client experience. So one will have to strategically be very smart in how we conduct business going forward with all the compliance documentation that are involved. Of course, the whole issue around inclusion. Unfortunately, I think that one of the objectives of the FSCA is not going to become a reality, and that is to offer financial services to low-income earners and have inclusion, to include the entire population of South Africa or a big part of them. I think as the burden of compliance, the burden of administration and the cost of compliance increase, the general public will not receive the advice that they deserve. And of course, barriers to entry. If I think back 30 years ago when I joined the financial services industry, the barriers to entry were extremely low, and the barriers to entry are just at unprecedented levels. This must be one of the toughest industries to come into. And then, of course, the cost of compliance. Let me touch on the cost of compliance again. I believe that this picture really gives a very realistic representation of the skew nature of how we must conduct business. On the one side, there's treating customers fairly, which I think the majority of advisors welcome. However, the cost of fit and proper requirements, adding to that your business infrastructure, compliance costs, etc., your conduct of business return, colleagues, the FSCA has proposed that the old compliance report is completed on a quarterly basis. Now, I spent 4.5 working days to understand the conduct of business return, to watch the FSCA's YouTube clips, and to log on to the FSCA website to comment on their proposal that FSPs submit quarterly compliance reports, referred to as conduct of business returns. Now that's going to put such a lot of pressure on small FSPs. We don't have the luxury of spending hours, additional time, spending on compliance and administration. It's going to, the burden is going to be tremendous. And then of course, we still sit with advice risk that we are not properly compensated for. And then of course, profit margins. Every business needs a profit margin to be sustainable. So the cost of compliance is something that we will have to re-evaluate again. Then of course, the ripple effects, if there is not some form of intervention from the industry to push back a little bit around the quarterly submission of compliance reports, the conduct of business return, and a number of the burdens that we will have to plan around, is firstly complexity. With volume, there's complexity. It's par for the course. And then compliance may get worse. In my view, it will get worse. The burden on infrastructure and resources will receive another facelift. And then of course, the burden of administration is the death of many talented financial advisors and intermediaries. And of course, your poor advisor experience has got a ripple effect. If you've got a poor advisor experience, there's a poor client experience. So what are the practical implications of the COFI Act? Firstly, the building blocks of any successful business, before phase, during phase, post phase into COFI, will remain the same. And I'll touch on that very briefly. But An admin burden that most people are dreading is the re-licensing exercise of financial services providers. I am hoping and I am begging the FSCA that this will be a more seamless exercise opposed to the initial registration of FSPs. You will know, for those of you who have recently gone through an application for registration of an FSP, that it takes a while and it's an admin hurdle. Can you imagine if all FSPs have to re-register with the FSCA? We are hoping that that's going to be a more seamless exercise. Of course, it's a costly exercise, it takes time, and it's full of administration. And then, of course, how we are going to register our representatives in view of transformation, etc. So for the medium-sized businesses, that may also pose a challenge. So what do we say about all these things? These are all factual things that are happening. That's the next wave coming. The FSR Act has already been implemented. The Kofi Bill is at the verge of being presented to Parliament. RDR have been put on the shelf for the time being, but the moment Kofi is implemented and becomes law, you will see another wave of administrative duties coming our way. So what do we say about all this? Firstly, colleagues, I think I went on a bit of an ego trip there. I had Colin Daniel, the cartoon artist, just put me there as part of the deliberation and part of the people who need to strategize with people like you to make sure that we design a future for financial services businesses where the foundation is set firmly, that can be weatherproof, whether it's phase, Kofi, or whatever legislation they bring, that we will be able to not only survive but thrive as well. So, how do we interpret all these challenges? Firstly, make sure that you gather enough information. The fact that you are watching this video speaks of gathering information, being aware of what's going to happen. Secondly, is obtain some perspective. And my perspective is but one perspective. However, I tried, before I deliver this video and this presentation, I've made sure that I have actually obtained a number of perspectives in the industry, valued perspectives, before I could have the confidence of addressing you during this presentation. And of course, we need to conduct a proper analysis of all the facts and the perspectives that we've gained, and counsel with the wise. Before I actually have any confidence in producing a video, I read a lot, I listen to perspectives, interpretations, etc., and then I form a view. You are so quick, and I speak for myself as well, to become a legend in your own mind. If you read something, you filter through it and you come to your own conclusions. I tried, the older I get, the more I try to counsel with the wise and just stress test some of my opinions. And then, of course, after counseling with the wise, we need to put a strategy together. And then after that strategy, even go further and stress test it again, whether that strategy is going to be firm and strong. And then, of course, a strategy that is not implemented is as good as no strategy at all. And that is what I want to bring to you, is take note of the negatives, but then counsel and stress test your opinions and then come to some conclusion. And what I've tried to do is, in my analysis, I consulted with a number of industry players, and there was general agreement that we've got a couple of common denominators that will determine our future. There are a number of elements that are actually of common interest when we consider them, and collaboration is going to be a key a part of our success going forward. And therefore, getting our hands dirty whenever the regulator make proposals and we need to collaborate. My submission to you today is we need to make very sure that we find common ground, we identify the commonalities, we identify mutual interests, and collectively we can lay a firm foundation for our success going forward. And of course, I believe that we should support, for those of you who belong to industry bodies, support those industry bodies, submit your recommendations to them, and collaborate as far as possible with industry bodies as they have got the resources to respond to the FSCA whenever they come whenever they submit proposals to us. I have consulted with the Financial Planning Institute, with the two of the directors, with Lelani Besaidnout and David Kopp. I've collaborated with them. We have stress tested a few ideas. So also with the Financial Intermediaries Association and SAIFA. I've entered into conversations with all three of those bodies, and we have generally agreed that the FSR Act and COFI deserves our attention, because if we don't communicate with the regulator and collaborate and identify common points of interest, we will not be able to lay a firm foundation. I believe that there's 80% of the success that will come from 20% of common interests. So I am calling on you to identify those key building blocks in your business that are of critical importance for you. I've made an attempt to summarize those key building blocks, and your views after listening to this video would be very helpful. So I've tried to put a slide together that actually summarizes all the critical aspects. I consulted with my former partner, Marius van der Merwe, when I presented this slide. He made the point that business principle, culture and governance actually may deserve a special reference, and I have included that in the holistic view. When you have a helicopter view on your business, what would it look like and what would the key building blocks be? And I submit to you that those key building blocks on the left hand side, the 10-step process of professional client engagement, have never changed. Prior to phase, during phase, and after COFI, you will still prospect, whether it's by word of mouth getting new clients or whether it is really aggressively prospecting, setting up meetings with clients, communicating, meeting with them, whether it's face-to-face or via Teams or Zoom, and then having conversations, sharing information, and gathering client information and coming to an agreement what you can do for the client. Then conducting an analysis, meaning taking all that information, doing a proper diagnosis, and then submitting your proposal to the client, and on agreement, there's a transaction that needs to be implemented. And of course, if you want to retain clients, you will do annual reviews on your clients' portfolios. So therefore, those 10 steps, I joined the industry in 1989. as more than 32 years ago. And even at that time, that is how you built a successful practice. And then, of course, the building blocks. People. We can't. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. That principle remains the same. Nobody has ever done it all alone. And then, of course, training. How has the training environment not evolved over the years? Business infrastructure, systems, processes, marketing, compliance, etc. They are all the underlying building blocks that have before phase, during phase, and after phase always supported a solid, profitable, and sustainable business. These building blocks will never change. Then, of course, if we use that as a framework for business, then we can start mapping legislation in accordance with our business framework. But then it doesn't become a compliance discussion, it becomes a business discussion. So the 10-step process of client engagement, the fundamentals of business, if we use that as a common point of reference, it will be easier for us to then, using the 10-step process as a proxy, is making sure that each one of those steps in our business strategy, we follow best practice principles. But you can never separate best practice from compliance. Professionalism and compliance are always intertwined. You can't separate the two. And then, of course, don't go digital before you haven't cemented the fundamentals. To automate, it's almost, if you go to the practice tee with a flawed grip and you hit ball after ball after ball with a flawed grip, you will never become a professional. So if your grip is flawed, it doesn't matter how often you practice, you will just make permanent the flawed aspects in your golf swing. The same applies to business. If you don't apply best practice and integrate compliance, but they are fundamentally correct and aligned, then you can automate and digitalize. And then, of course, that will spill over to a more positive advisor experience, and the ripple effect and the benefit would be a better client experience. Colleagues, what we are dealing with is a wave of legislation. The only way we will make sense of it is if we take the business and cement the best practice principles, and that becomes the dominating conversation. You map legislation into business. Please don't try to map business into compliance. Many businesses suffer from over-compliance and over-regulation, and we need, as key individuals, to regain the leadership of our businesses. We lead and compliance supports, but we need a facelift in terms of our perspective about the regulatory wave that is coming. Bottom line is, one of the most important areas that will be affected is your client engagement process. So the 10-step process of professional client engagement is one of the areas where you can already position yourself for COFI, simply because there are principles that applied before phase, during phase, and they will remain under COFI. Colleagues, at the end of it all, the intention of the regulator is pure. It is to treat customers fairly. If we aim to achieve that, we will need to go back to the drawing board, consider what our client engagement process looks like, and make sure that we can map the market conduct legislation into that process appropriately. In closing, we have to have a vision for the future. It's not all doom and gloom, but we must have a good, solid perspective that we bring to the party. And it's going to be valuable to be proactive and not reactive. There are certain things that you can do right now before COFI is implemented to stress test and to reconsider and refresh, rejuvenate your client engagement process, following the principles under COFI that's already part of the bill, and the General Code of Conduct already provides financial services providers with a solid point of reference. The second half of this presentation today, we're going to focus on a topic that really gets my juices flowing, to analyze phase Ombud determinations and see what lessons we can learn from those determinations. Really excites me. So I know you are not getting excited, but I'm highly excited to share this topic with you. We're going to share 4 case studies, and it all relates to unit trust type of investments, pretty much in your field. So let's give you an indication of the bullet points, the aspects that the Ombud have ruled on in the past. Now, you can scan a lot quicker than I can read these topics, but a few of those we will see how it plays out in the determinations and case studies. At the outset, a few important remarks. The first Ombud of the South African Ombuds Office for Financial Services Providers, the late Mr. Charles Pillay, made a profound statement. And he said that cases are won or lost based on facts. If you bring us the right evidence, chances are small that we will find against you. And at the center of our determinations is poor record keeping. And this you will see plays out in all of these case studies. The Ombud always makes reference in phase Ombud determinations to the fact that the purpose of the Ombud is to dispose of complaints, equitable in the decision making, impartial, etc. But here's the highlight: with due regard to the contractual relationship between the parties. You will see how important this reference is in the first 2 instances where advisors were the beneficiaries of great phase Ombud decisions. The first is Arno Burger, based in Pretoria, and before the infamous Fidentia was formed, Arno had a business registered as Fidentia Financial Advisors CC. So long before the other firm made all these mistakes and court cases came about, Arno operated under that name. Arno is one of the more astute financial advisors, and he's been in practice for many, many years. A certified financial planner and dedicated to his clients. And one of his clients, Dr. Malcolm Arnold Birkin, complained, and the phase Ombud, the late Charles Pillay, made this very important point at the outset. Firstly, paragraph 4 of the determination, he highlighted the following: an agreement headed Investment Advice Agreement was entered into at Pretoria on the 29th of October 2004. Colleagues, hats off to Arno. He was one of the first adopters of the principle around contracting with clients. And that investment advice agreement, which we drafted together, Arno adopted it into his practice, and it contained aspects like confirmation of the investment objective and the target return. The Ombud highlighted, he said it was worth noting that in the agreement, the following: the investment objective was long-term growth. There was a minimum holding period referred to as 3 years in order to achieve that benchmark, also recognizing that it's long-term, but minimum term of 3 years was highlighted. And then, of course, he contracted with the client that investment capital or returns could not be guaranteed. These are some of the very important fundamentals that were confirmed in the investment advice agreement. What transpired is that the Ombud used the investment advice agreement as the single most important point of reference in this determination. And based on that agreement, the Ombud found no evidence to support the allegations by the client. So the first couple of things that will be important for you to take away from this: written agreement, evidence, confirmed the needs and the objectives, the minimum term, and then of course that it couldn't be guaranteed. Moving on to the second case study, the client was Francois Barnard and the advisor was from First Global. Now this was one of the more astute advisors again, from analyzing that this is typically the amity type of philosophy that was followed, or at least the way that we have engaged with you, highlighting the principles that will be of importance. In this specific case, the complainant alleged, 1, that he was conservative, 2, the advisor breached that risk profile, went more aggressive, he reconfirmed his risk profile to the FACE Ombud's office, and then of course the investment period, the time, March 2009. You can see how this plot thickens because markets dropped, and this is how the client's portfolio was structured by First Global. There was an allocation made to the money market. There was a cautious fund of fund, moderate fund of fund, and international fund of fund. It was a good spread of risk, taking care of short, medium, and long-term needs. The Ombud found the written mandate in 2005 and 2007 respectively confirmed that the client agreed to a moderate risk profile. That was the written evidence, despite the allegations that he was conservative. And the Ombud found that this structure was actually consistent with the client's risk profile. What did the client do in March 2009? He couldn't stomach the volatility anymore, and by his own accord, he switched all his investments into the money market. And he claimed that the advisor failed to act on his instructions. But the Ombud found there was nothing on record that explicitly showed that the client instructed the advisor to switch. The Ombud made the observation. He said, to the advisor's credit, it was clear from the correspondence that he cared for the client's financial well-being and that he advised the client to stick to the plan. And unfortunately, the client did not do so and switched. Regrettably, there was a switch. The Ombud noted that markets recovered shortly after that, and had the client remained invested and stuck to the strategy as recommended by the advisor, he would have made up those losses. So therefore, in his final determination, the Ombud found that on the evidence provided, what evidence? The mandate, the written agreement, plus the correspondence between the two, and the Ombud said, based on that evidence, we could actually find no reason to find in favor of the client, and the complaint was dismissed. The next two case studies follow the following philosophy. Typically, in both these instances, the same advisors, two different clients. Typically, when clients see that they don't have enough money to retire, they always want higher returns, and if their funds are invested more conservatively, they become more nervous, or they're typically not happy with the returns. What happened here? The advice was, you want higher returns to sustain your income longer, we need to go up the risk scale. We need to expose your funds to more risky investments. Of course, the higher the targeted return or the desired return, the bigger the potential paper losses as markets move up and down. Again, same period, March 2009, the investments were made in November 2008 and 2009. In both these instances, it was the losses that the client experienced, and hence the complaints. What typically happened in this instance, the next case, where the clients were Godfrey Frederick Botha and Elizabeth Helen Botha, they had the same scenario. Income was a requirement, living annuities were at play, and income was consistently required on a monthly basis in both cases, and then there was this aggressive portfolio with high volatility. A couple of interesting things, both of these clients, separate case studies, were in more conservative investments. It was recommended that they go in higher risk investments with the promise of higher returns, but then the bottom line is, whenever there are losses, clients forget what was explained to them, and they made the allegations that the risk implications, what does that mean? Volatility and potential losses from time to time, or reduction in market value of the portfolios. And then they make this profound statement, which I can understand. The compliance said they would never have invested in such high risk portfolios if they had understood the volatility to which they were exposed. Very important. The same facts, almost to a T, in the case of Christoffel Andries Skutte. More or less the same facts, and the complainant said it's inappropriate advice to move as a conservative investor into aggressive portfolios while having to withdraw income. So this is the case study. Of course, what happened in March 2009, November 2008, the investments were made. March 2009, we had a severe setback in the markets, which affected long-term portfolios. But in this case, there were income withdrawals as well. And the complainants pointed out in their complaint that no provision was made for short-term or medium needs. And the income withdrawals actually led to selling more units from their investments. And you will know, if you sell more units, it impacts your recovery. So basically, the two circles on the left-hand corner of your screen were absent. Even the first three, there was one portfolio which was intended to provide capital growth, but it also had to sustain their income. As a result of the material reduction in the price of the underlying funds, of course, their nervousness and anxiety just reached different levels. And no surprise, there was a complaint laid. And of course, in the one matter, in Andries Schutter's case, there was a risk profile question which stated that if it means that there are dramatic ups and downs on a year-to-year basis in my portfolio, will you be willing to tolerate that for the sake of long-term growth? And the client said strongly agree. However, there was no quantification to what extent such a portfolio may lose its value. And this is where it's critical that evidence of the potential drawdown must be on file and agreed by the client. If the advisors had such a document, instead, they said, we told the client, but the Ombud, as you know, is going to say, don't tell me, show me. And the most important document that you can have from a risk tolerance point of view is one where the downside is quantified and the client signs it off. In this case, the need to withdraw income during a dramatic downturn just compounds and irreversibly locks in the losses. That's a critical point. So the Ombud recognizes that if markets are down, you want to stay the course, but if you are dependent on income, you've got no option but to sell on a down and therefore selling off more units, which of course locks in losses, and basically that portfolio may never recover to its full extent. And then of course the Ombud makes the point that without quantifying the potential downside, how can a client make an informed decision? So it's just a ripple effect without evidence, without due process, without disclosure of potential downturn. An informed decision cannot be made. And in this case, there was a determination against the financial services provider on both counts. Colleagues, we will send out the phase Ombud determinations that I highlighted, but hopefully you can see from this executive summary that investment objectives and needs will always be required in the evidence. Investment term is critically important because it instructs us of what a realistic return may be over that period. And then of course your benchmark. What is your required return? Without that you cannot determine the required risk. And then of course whether the client is willing and able to tolerate that risk. With risk capacity, we mean that if there's income generating needs, then provision must be made for income to be withdrawn to create the capacity for the longer term portfolios to perform. Then of course suitability, appropriateness is always at the center of the Ombud's determinations. And last but not least, your product disclosures, liquidity aspects, as well as volatility. Colleagues, I hope that you take some valuable golden nuggets from this presentation. Most of you have followed these principles religiously, and I know for a fact that your record keeping also received a facelift over the years. And when you do reviews, please make sure that these aspects are clearly communicated to your clients. Thank you so much for joining me. It was an absolute pleasure being part of this platform today.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending this month's webinar. We will upload the recording to our YouTube channel and website. We would like to thank Anton Swanepoel for the regulatory update. If you would like to get in touch with us, please contact Tanya Kutsia, Advisor Experience Manager at Amity Investment Solutions.